All right, so special populations, and again, Jennifer, I think you wanted to make a note on this.
Yeah, thank you. I did want to offer a little context for this next section here. I mentioned earlier that our Department of Justice grant required that applicants address how we would serve special populations, including youth impacted by addiction and youth with an incarcerated parent. And our impact sites have done an initial survey that found that across the 10 sites, our grant is currently serving at least 40 youth affected by addiction and 27 youth with an incarcerated parent. Nearly all 10 sites were serving at least one youth in one of these populations. And I say all this because, if you're not part of impacts, you may not know whether you're serving youth impacted by addiction or youth with an incarcerated parent. It's not something we ask in our A&P reports or our youth impact surveys, but it's very likely that you are. So we think and hope that this next section on those two special populations will be applicable to everyone.
Thanks, Jennifer. And as Jennifer and I were talking, kind of preparing for today, I realized what a great point that sort of sub point comes from that. And that is, we're never going to know the full story of the folks we're working with, right? So when you're not serving a particular population who is facing a particular issue, right, then you may not know that they're a trauma survivor, or you may not know that this youth's parent is currently incarcerated, or you may not know that this youth's parent is struggling with drug addiction, right? So that's all the more reason why that trauma-informed approach is critical, because we don't know what folks' experiences are. If you think about yourself, Holly or Maria or Fran, like, you have your own story. No one knows your whole story. And in some cases, folks will never know, right? Those things that maybe would come up on one of my PowerPoints, right? But you know that if folks were to treat you in a way that honors some of maybe the unique challenges you have as a result of those experiences, that would be really awesome, right? So that's the whole point in the trauma-informed approach, is that we're always cognizant, whether or not we know that someone's been through said issue or life challenge, that we're showing up thoughtfully. And when we see a behavior that feels funky or feels misaligned, that rather than judge that behavior as negative or something that needs to be addressed, see it as a sign that maybe I need to go heavy on empathy right now, even if I don't have the answers as to the why. And that's the other piece too, is that we're never going to be full experts on everything to do with trauma-informed everything, because at minimum, we know every human is different, and what we need and what kind of response we need is different. So I could spend 3 million hours with you guys, and we can't be experts at every individual's reality, right? So the bottom line is just always to show up with empathy and thoughtfulness, right? So I guess that's enough on that. So for the substance misuse population, obviously the opioid epidemic really sort of brought that population to light. I did that opioid training with a National Mentor a couple of years ago, and I'm doing some work with them to refresh that. And even in that work, what many people thought as who's affected by opioids is not necessarily what folks thought. It's like it's all Caucasian rural people, right? Which wasn't the case then. And in the new data, not only was it not the case then, but when we look at where and what kind of drugs are being used and how this whole thing is playing out, it's totally different than it was 2 or 3 years ago when I did that research and training. So substance misuse is similar to working with minority populations, in that a lot of stigma, a lot of judgment, and just a lot of misunderstanding, right? So we're not going to go into those details today, but just want to cover a couple of points to be thoughtful about. This first slide just talks about how substance misuse can impact parenting. Obviously, neglect and time and attention might be an obvious one. Overly permissive is another one, where maybe the kids kind of can just do whatever they want to do because the parent's busy struggling with what they're struggling with. Enmeshment and lack of boundaries, treating their children as sort of like their friends. Failure to provide the structure and discipline, potentially high stress or use during pregnancy, excessive, harsh, abusive discipline, and sometimes just the inability to provide basic needs. And really, this is kind of like, you could have like the overly permissive, hanging out, fun parent, which is really struggling with addiction. And then you could have like that really harsh situation where it's obvious that there's a problem. But there's a lot of ways in which substance misuse can affect parenting. And it's the challenge with addiction too, is that addiction is the most extreme version of misuse, but there's a whole lot of folks who are not necessarily in the category of addiction, but are struggling with misuse. And so that can be kind of hard to detect and to deal with and figure out how to respond. This slide just really speaks to sort of some of the traumatic experiences that youth who are living with a parent or an adult struggling with misuse might deal with. Obviously, abandonment physically if the parent is not around, but also emotional abandonment if they're not present, right? Not really engaging. Assuming caregiver roles for themselves or their siblings or their parent, right? So some of them are working to provide for their family or getting themselves and their siblings ready for school, helping with homework, sometimes even physically or emotionally caring for a parent. Oftentimes there's guilt and shame, just, embarrassment from their parents' use or struggling to try to figure out how to hide their use. Some of them are struggling feeling responsible for that use, being talked about at school. And then this is a big one, that internal conflict. And I see this even with youth who are in foster care where their parents, something happened where they were removed. There's that conflict between the desire to kind of give help and support or feeling like you're betraying your parent by siding with the folks who are saying that their parents' behavior is problematic. Some other issues include pressure to perform or underperform. So when I did the listening tour a couple of years ago, we heard stories of parents who were challenging their youth not to do well in school so that they could qualify for certain programs or assistance. Others are trying to be perfect to kind of avoid drawing attention or to avoid the wrath of a parent if they're not behaving in a way that their parents want them to. Obviously, basic needs not being met, witnessing abuse, drug use, or other inappropriate behaviors in the home. Unfortunately, some of them have been through the actual death of a caregiver or parent, and then that constant cycle of hope and disappointment as that parent goes through change, sobriety, whether or not they're going to get quality time, and over time, just that feeling of hopelessness that can come up as a result of that. Any questions or thoughts just on that quick couple points on youth struggling or families impacted by misuse, substance misuse?
Hi, I couldn't find my hand raising.
Oh,
I think, but I'm just gonna talk.
yeah, just come on, because I can't see all you guys. So even if you raise your hand, I might not see it. So just go ahead and come on. It's all good.
Okay. Well, excuse me. A lot of this is also, it's hard to tell because and it goes with trauma and what you said about poverty. And a lot of this can be seen in parents who are working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet and adding that stress onto it. So I just kind of want to say that sometimes there's a correlation between two, whether or not they're using drug or not, but that poverty can also exhibit these behaviors as well.
Yeah, that's a good call. And that's why I always try to bring up poverty in that trauma conversation, because I feel like people don't think about poverty when they think about trauma. But if you are blessed to have never been hungry or struggled like that in your life, just knowing like if you have to go long without food, I mean, I don't know about you guys, like I can get really mean, right? So I mean, and that's like a casual adult reality, and I'm completely capable of doing something about it. So you think about the stressor of constantly not having, constantly struggling. I mean, even some of us are living check to check, even if we are paying the bills, and we know that that's stressful. So I think that's one of those, and I appreciate you making that point, that we just have to really remember that struggle, it's constant too. It's not like it's an incident, it's ongoing. So good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
I wanted to say something following up on what my guy just said, that in our population, something that's very common is the eldest sibling gets a lot of the responsibility for the little ones.
Yep.
And I was wondering if that would constitute maybe like is it a trauma, or is it just stress that they're going through? Because it might not be necessarily drug abuse or this
Mhm.
kind of we're talking about, but there's definitely these symptoms, as my guy just mentioned, that they do populate. And I've seen the stress that these older siblings go through because of working parents and trying to
Yeah.
make.
You know, it's interesting. We've gone so hard on the term trauma, and just in this past year, I am like realizing I personally am going to start abandoning the word trauma, although it's hard because when someone like Jennifer is looking for someone to do a training, then that's the word, that's the language they know. But the more I've thought about all of this, to your question, is it trauma? Is that I would prefer to use the term impactful, right? It makes it easier to understand, because then you're like, is it trauma? So was it hard enough to be a trauma? But if we just say impactful experience, then there's less question, right? About, is that an impactful experience to be adultified and always be caring for yourself and your siblings? I'd say so, right? And the other thing is that sometimes you don't realize how heavy a thing is, right? And sometimes the hard thing is also combined with something good, like, so to be honored, to have the responsibility, or you have your parents trust you, like, so there's the good part of that. But then it's like, and then you love your siblings, but then you like kind of wish you could play more, right? So I don't know if we would call it trauma, but we could definitely say it's impactful life experience. Is that something that could likely impact how someone interacts with life later? Yes. It could turn out to be one of those high performers, like we just talked about earlier, right? Where they are really responsible and really like on point with everything, who is also the person who doesn't know how to like balance themselves and take care of themselves, because they're always on point and always thinking about everyone else. And to someone else's point, could result in some codependency, where you always feel like you need to be looking out for someone else. So again, these are the reasons why, you know, we say the word trauma just to, I think, to help us all know what we're talking about. But we're all having life experiences. All of our youth are having life experiences that, depending on how it's internalized, is impactful, and even impactful for the good, right? So an impactful experience could be for the good, because I can say that all of even the funky stuff I've been through, I can tell you something good that I learned from it, or some way in which I was able to, you know, use that resiliently, you know, in my life later. But nonetheless, it was, you know, a hard moment. So I think this just again reiterates the point. We're all having life experiences and being thoughtful about how life impacts how we see ourselves, others, in the world. That's really what this comes down to kind of simplify it. Does that make sense, Gustavo, and sort of respond to your point? Cool. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is my, I don't want to be
No, you're
a
good.
hoarder of this, but I, along with what Gus said, is like, then it goes into the level of intersectionality between culture and what the different cultural
Yes.
responsibility and expectations are. Because like, you know, I, for example, am Hmong, and I am the oldest child, so those are my roles and responsibilities. So I wouldn't consider that as trauma, but then how would you know trauma, which then gets me into a cycle of, is trauma a Western type of like definition
It is.
or experiences versus like a more Asian cultural experiences in that too. So it just, I mean, it's always interesting. Trauma work is also interesting to me, and language and all of
Yes.
that.
Yeah. And you know what? I at some point I probably will completely get to where I can not use it, because like I'm pretty much committed to the fact that I don't like the word anymore. I like that, because really all it comes down to, take all the extraness away, it comes down to being responsive, understanding that everyone has a life journey, right? Like we don't even have to go for past that. I would also, you reminded me, I had lost my point because I was getting so into everything I was saying. On the culture tip, I think another challenge with culture and trauma is that some of the very nature of culture, especially with POCs, is that, again, that double-edged sword. So if you're in a communal culture, like your culture and mine, right? looking out for one another, always making sure everyone's okay. Like, we love that part of our culture, but there's some stuff about that can be problematic. And as POCs, like, we don't want to call our peeps out and be like, yo, there's part of this that actually hasn't been good for me, right? Because, your auntie was so supportive, and she always, so I think that's a whole conversation, right? About where is the difference between the Eurocentric components of the trauma definition that are problematic, but also where are the applications of some of this actually is an issue, and it has to do with culture and how we've always done it within certain cultures that maybe isn't so great anymore. I think about the African-American culture and the heavy commitment to church and Christianity, and then that leads to, you don't go get help, you just let the pastor pray on it, and we don't need counseling, so it was great at first, and then there's this other end of the spectrum where, like, whoa, hold on. But then we're like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to, like, disrespect my elders. So that, so then you're like in this debate with being trauma informed and culture responsive and earning my family, so, like, clearly I'm not about solving none of them problems today, but it is a thing, right? And something to be thoughtful about. So thanks for that good combo. I love it. Anybody else want to add to that? And thank you guys so much for engaging. This is so much better when I'm not just the only one talking. All right, so I just have one quick slide on and the impact of incarceration on youth and their family. And again, none of this, let's be clear, A, I can't teach you guys everything in one day, and B, there's no one slide or 2 slides or 10 slides that would ever cover everything. So I show it with that asterisk next to everything. But here are a couple of things, and really, to your point, a lot of this stuff looks just like what we just saw on AOD impacted families or poverty impacted families. So not necessarily unique, but there are certainly some nuances. So things to think about: abandonment, actual or emotional. I think that strain of having visits when you have a parent incarcerated, A, almost always they're at least an hour away. B, you as a youth have to hope that your family will take you to see your parent or your loved one as much as you'd like to see them. The worry about the parent, guilt, anger, confusion, all of that stuff. That caregiver role is once again at play here, especially when you look at the single family home component that incarceration then causes. Feeling that shame, again, about having a parent who's incarcerated. Of course, the financial difficulties. A couple of things, and I happen to have extensive experience working in prisons. I've spoken at almost every prison in the state, and it's a population I really enjoy working with. But let's keep it real. The prison system is questionable at times, right? So if you've ever visited someone in prison, then it's very likely you might have encountered some really funky behavior by the people who check you in and decide whether or not you get to visit, and what you can wear and how much time you can spend. So just going in, if you've never done it, I can just tell you it's traumatic. Just being in there, like, just the process, right? It's a lot, let alone if you're a kid. I've not done it as a kid. I've done it as an adult, and it's so not only as a kid do you know that your parent or loved one is in there, but you see how the staff are acting at times, and you know that same staff is with your loved one. So what's happening? Those are things that kids would have to deal with. Another big one is that cycle. If you're familiar at all with incarceration, whether it's when you first get arrested or when you're trying to get out later and you've served time, that whole thing of whether or not you're going to get your parole hearing, whether or not they're going to give you parole, whether or not when you go to court you're going to actually get a ruling that day. Like, it is such a horrible cycle, and I went through that as a child in my trauma of having to go to court, and then you stress for 2 weeks leading up to it, and you go and then nothing happens. You sat there for 4 hours, nothing happened, and then you leave, and then you wait for 30 days and you just do it over and over again. So that's one of those unique components of this population. Another one is negative attitudes that the family members might have about the incarcerated person. So if you're a kid and you love your parent who's incarcerated, your auntie might not, or your mama might not love your dad because he's left me, you know, so you got dealing with them talking about negatively, your family talking negatively about the person who's incarcerated. And of course, as a result, there's risk for adoption of maladaptive activity behaviors. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind on that population. Anybody want to add anything on that, or comments worth adding?
I wanted to add something, and I don't know if we will be grateful for COVID or not, but now with kids that have incarcerated parents, there's the option of doing video calls with them, so that avoids the 4-hour drive, 2-hour drive to see them, and the impact before and after on the family, on their emotional situation. I think that it helps a little bit with the connection between the youth and the member of the family who is incarcerated. And now it's a little odd to think that they can just call anytime, they can just video call twice a week. That helps a little bit, right? Helps a little bit with that emotional support, and with that like negative talking between like the family members, and the kids can actually see that the member, the parent, whoever is in prison, that actually cares about the kids, right? Actually is there for them whenever they need it. So another thing that I wanted to add is, how do you refer to that member, that parent, to the kids? Like, how do you, I think I asked you this before, and is what are the words we use? Like, sometimes I'm trying to talk to that kid, like that young person, about their parent who is incarcerated. They really want to talk about it and they really want to get out there, but then which words do you use, right? Like, how do you want to refer to court and the time, all that stuff? I think is very tough for me personally, to say, oh yeah, your dad is in jail and you this, like, it's too rough. Like, it's too rough for a young person to just hear those words. But I don't know other words to actually talk about it, you know?
Yeah, I think one suggestion, because you could really ask that question for any scenario or any person or family you're dealing with, of like, what are the right words? I always start with what are the words they use, and that gives me an idea of what words I might use. And sometimes, and this is a big one, like sometimes we get so worried about how to do this or what to say and not say. Sometimes we just need to ask, right? How would you like for me to refer, or what words would you like to use? You know, depending on the situation, sometimes we just need to ask. And then again, take the lead from what words and language they're using. I think also sometimes, while we're very thoughtful, and I think it's awesome, sometimes we also underestimate just how resilient our kids are, and that they can handle more than we think they can. But always following their lead, no matter who I'm working with, even with you guys, and Jennifer can tell you, I'm listening and I'm sensing, and I'm responding even in this moment to decide how heavy I go on one point versus another, because I'm in tune with you and I'm catching your vibe. So when we just show up to every relationship like that's a more simple answer, because there's no one answer, right, Maria, to your question. But when we catch vibe and we're really just sensing who's in front of us and what's happening in the moment, then that gives us some clue as to what and when and what words. I know it's not an exact answer, Maria, but it's the best one I got for you right now. Anybody else want to add something on that?
Yeah, this is James Carter here calling from Memphis. I love to tap in and just to piggyback off what you were saying. And even see, I've had some experience working with special ed in this day treatment program, which is your self-contained group. And many of these young people have experienced trauma in some shape, form, or fashion. And I've always found, especially with the young men, man, it's just building that relationship, you know. And a lot of times, a lot of things you don't even have to worry about bringing up because they're going to bring it to you. You know, the
Yep,
more
yep.
comfortable they feel. Again, just keeping in mind context. And like she said, I think that language was huge.
Yeah.
Kind of just listening for where they're coming from. You know, the more you know about them. And sometimes, especially again with these young men, just being not brutally honest, sorry to use that language, but you know, just talking about the reality. 'Cause
Authentic.
a lot of
We'll
things,
say authentic.
authentic. You know, a lot of times we don't talk about these issues, and so you know they've got to be brought up. And that's something just as a community we've got to get over that. And we definitely have to be able to look into that mirror and embrace, you know, what's going on, and then how do we overcome these challenges. So I think the better the relationship, you know, the easier that is to do, and again, the more authentic it is all the way around.
I love it. Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to challenge myself because I want to say so much more that I'm not,
Can I say something?
because we're going to get into that a little bit more here in a moment. And I will let you, was that you, Tamitra?
I
Tamitra?
listen.
Yeah, hold on one second. We're going to go a little deeper on that, but I love that point. What was your name? Was it James?
Yeah, James Carter.
James. Well, you throw me off because it says R. Troy Wilkins. So somehow I was able to catch that. Okay.
Yeah, this is actually my first day. I just started with Best Buy.
Okay, well, welcome. So glad to be with you.
Yes.
But you made a great point. It's all about relationship, and we're going to talk in a minute about relationship, how we go about building relationship, and how much timing matters. So I'm going to hold myself because I have a whole thing on that in a minute. But Tamitria, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to mention, like, kind of piggybacking, but one of the major things, like when I think about incarcerated parents, is by the time the trauma that the youth or the families have already been through and building that foundation, but how, when it comes to certain things, how do you explain to your child, your youth, whatever the case may be, what exactly it is that you went away for? So say dad went away and he ends up on Megan's Law website. How do you explain that charge or that purpose behind his incarceration? Like, and then it just goes, you never really know how it's going to go, because it's not even just being judged for being in jail. It's also has that, oh, well, he went because he did something to whatever the case may be. So
Yeah.
I feel as if it's not just incarcerated, but that, how do you explain that incarceration when they come home?
Yep.
I feel like that's a major thing.
Yeah, well, and again, when you think about all of these life experiences, this one included, we got the thing, and then we got the results that happen because of the thing, right? So, and how it impacts me right after it happens versus how that might show up 10 years later or 5 years later, like it's really evolving as to how it impacts us. So hopefully we aren't in our roles explaining to someone why their parent went away, because I don't know that that's our role or our right to do so. So that's one of those boundary things, which we are going to talk about as well. Somebody said instead of saying they're on vacation. Yeah. So yeah, I can't go into that as much as I want, but I do, that language is important. And I think we have to be thoughtful about where is our seat, you know, what is our responsibility? Because the parent is definitely going to have to figure out how to explain that later. But I don't think it's our role to be running through those details or attempting, and I'm not saying you were, but it made me that you were saying that, but I think it's important to clarify that that's one of those boundary things. And again, we're going to talk about it more, of us understanding what is our role. Because sometimes we get so interested in being helpful that we start becoming unhelpful because we're trying to be helpful, right? So we're going to get into that more. I'm still holding back. You guys are challenging me, but I'm not going to go deeper than that right now. So I'm going to come back to that though. Anybody else? Gustavo, I see you off mute.
Yeah, I wanted to say something too about like the word incarceration, how, you know, it has really negative connotations, that because, you know, people will do illegal things and get in trouble. But I also want to say that in our community, I think these feelings in youth can happen with deportation, which might be more like an injustice that they're seeing it, as opposed to something negative as to why they're being quote unquote incarcerated or just being deported away from the country. So that's a real big fear.
Yeah.
Especially during the Trump administration, when ICE was coming into a lot of these Southern California cities, there was a lot of anxiety going around about that. So I just wanted to bring that up, that sometimes it might not be like something that negative that has happened or something illegal, and it seems more like an injustice to the youth,
Yes.
but that these feelings are still propagating in them. So
Yeah, and that even further, like, so sometimes they're being incarcerated and it's really because of injustice or oppression. And then other times we have family, or we have a feeling that we're being done wrong, but we kind of like are wrong, like we really did actually do something bad. And then like, so you have a family who's like, they did him dirty and but he like actually did rob the bank, and you know what I mean? So like that's a whole thing too of like, if we're showing up a certain way and the family showing up a certain way. But this is also, again, why boundaries are important, because if we're getting this deep into a conversation, there's a good chance we're off track, depending on how, and you guys are not going to get me to go into that because we're going into that later. So I'm staying true to the game. Astrid, is it Astrid?
Yes. Good morning,
Oh.
everyone. I'm Astrid. So I used to actually run a summer camp where I would take young people anywhere from like 11 to 18 to go visit their moms in federal prison.
Mhm.
So a lot of these conversations, like these young people already were aware that their parents, well, obviously they were in prison, but they have very vivid memories of their parents being arrested and how they themselves as children were victimized by the police coming in. So when the police are actually coming in and arresting a parent, they're treating everyone inside of the household as someone who's broken the law, right? So you're talking about little kids, 8 years old in the middle of the night, probably, like just from conversations that, where young people were sharing their experiences. And so they already have all these memories, which is already like traumatic in itself.
Yeah.
And then having their parents leave, now you're having grandparents take on that parent role. And it's really difficult for grandparents to be able to take time out, because now they have to usually get other jobs to be able to provide, even though they're getting like, government assistance or whatever. But it's just in itself, going into the prison system, because, and I'm not going to say everyone, but in my experience, I've noticed that all of the people that have worked in these institutions already believe that these people are bad because they're in there for a reason, and they're going to treat their young people exactly the same way. So it's really unfortunate. It's heartbreaking, because it's almost like these young people are expected to kind of follow in their parents' footsteps.
Yeah.
And like they are very, like they're just treated terribly. There's like all these systems that are put in place to like keep parents, and because of COVID, I know that now that's changed a bit. But when we were going up there, like we had to literally pass through like all these, like it's just crazy. Like you can't wear certain things, and if you are wearing it, there are organizations. Yes, there are organizations at some of the facilities that will have extra clothes or extra shoes if, let's say, you're not wearing the right kind of thing. But I had one experience where one of the officers told one of my young people, because they forgot to leave their cell phone inside of the inside of one of our vans. And this officer was like, oh yeah, I can arrest you because this is a crime. And although it is like, by the rules that they set in place, just kind of like someone telling a young person that who's there to see their parent, like it's just, again, all these systems are set in place for a reason. Yep. So I just think that really kind of like having the incarcerated population already like face all of these things, and a lot of the times why they're in prison is because of systematic oppression. Like there's all these things in place, like they're in there for theft, they're in there for things that now people are making money off of. So it's unjust, it's frustrating, it's heartbreaking, but I'm really loving this conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you. And this is why we're here, right? You guys, this is why we're here. We know, unfortunately, because if any one of us could have changed the world fully by now, I know it was on my radar for a long time. I was going to change the world, but it hasn't worked out yet. But if we could have, right, disrupted all of this ridiculousness, we would have. So the next best thing is doing what we do, right? In showing up, being supportive. And again, this is why it's thoughtful that we understand what folks are going through, that we understand racism, that we understand systemic oppression, and we understand then how we show up properly so that we add value. And again, we're going to get into this in a minute, how we make sure we do that in a way where we don't go so hard on loving on the peeps that we don't ultimately start causing harm.